Right. Well, I was a child participant in DARPA's Project Pegasus. DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. There was an actual time-space exploration program that emerged in the U.S. government. In fact, it was the program for which other concepts and project information in the time travel literature was developed to partially obscure what was going on. Most of the other accounts, the Philadelphia experiment, the Montauk project literature, they do contain valid information, but it has to be put in perspective in terms of the program that emerged under DARPA in the late 1960s and early 1970s. That was essentially the time-space exploration program of the U.S. government at the time of its emergence. There were roots in something like the Philadelphia experiment that occurred during World War II, and clearly I'm affirming the Montauk literature of Preston Nichols and Peter Moon because I know that some of their most significant data points I can verify. So I just want to make that clear. There's been some question of whether or not I'm refuting their data. I'm not. In fact, I think I figured out the relationship between Project Pegasus and Project Montauk. So maybe we can discuss that today when we address the Montauk.
Absolutely.
But now at midlife, as a trial lawyer here in Washington State, I mean, I've spent 10 years going back and figuring out what happened to me in Project Pegasus and writing it down and actively investigating it, contacting people who were involved. And I'm soon going to be publishing a tell-all memoir about my experiences on the project. Simultaneously, I've launched a truth campaign within the disclosure movement to call for the declassification and public adoption of one of the quantum access technologies that was developed by Project Pegasus, and that was physical teleportation of human beings derived from the works of Nikola Tesla. And that's actually the fifth quantum access device we're going to be talking about today. Now, it's difficult to call for the declassification of these technologies because in the other prong of my truth campaign, I'm trying to articulate the fact that there are profoundly, deeply political reasons why the U.S. government, as currently formulated, is going to resist disclosure of these technologies, and that is to say that there's been a political cover-up of the way in which the intelligence that has been gathered by these devices that have been in existence now for 40 years has been used. Let me cite one example. I know to a personal certainty that because the U.S. Defense Department began gathering data from non-local events, so we're talking about from the perspective of the present, past, and future events going on non-locally in the quantum hologram on adjacent timelines relative to the observer, that data has been taken and used politically. How has it? Well, even though there was a consensus among the project people that I had contact with as a child on Project Pegasus that we should never play God and try to influence or, for example, prevent future events or implement future events based on prior knowledge of them, that instead the intelligence gathered via quantum access would be used to engage in essentially contingency planning for future events. That nonetheless, there was a decision made to approach future American presidents and presumably vice presidents. I don't know if it was just limited to the presidency. But I know to a personal certainty that the presidents that have held the White House, the presidency, since the early 1970s have been approached prior to their presidencies and informed of their destiny as president. Now, that may have been an intelligent decision. Clearly, if your primary goal is survival and peace in a nuclear age, you clearly want individuals who are psychologically prepared for the presidency, if not educated for the presidency. But my difficulty with that, as a member of the Washington State Bar, I've sworn a sacred oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution. The problem with that is that was something that was completely outside the contemplation of the framers of the U.S. Constitution. The notion that, for example, during the last election, on the day that Barack Hussein Obama announced his candidacy for the presidency, he knew he was going to win. That clearly conferred a winner's advantage in terms of his attitude, his voice modulation, his demeanor, and other things that people would look to for leadership in a human being. And that, in fact, was the same winner's advantage of the previous presidents who had been approached prior to their presidencies and basically told the unfortunate news of what their destinies included. Now, I know as a result of serving on Project Pegasus, well, let me just cite how I know these data points regarding the president.
Sure.
We know that they had Jimmy Carter's name because in 1971 they were bringing some of my books back from the future and studying them because they were aware of the fact that I was destined to become the principal whistleblower about the activities of Project Pegasus. One of my books was the book I edited for Alfred Lambermont Weber, Exopolitics, the 2005 Universe Books edition of Exopolitics. Well, in the front matter, the front pages to that very singular work, literally the seminal work in the field of exopolitics, there is a quote by President Jimmy Carter. And I know that that book was analyzed and that Carter's name, Jimmy Carter, who was then the governor of Georgia, was identified as future American president. My father and I had the pleasure of meeting George H.W. Bush and his young son in his mid-20s, George W. Bush, in 1971 at one of the lunches that was being held in Project Pegasus, where they were bringing future political leaders through the project and informing them of their destiny. And at that luncheon, the project people were occupying 3 or 4 tables, actually an entire wing of a restaurant. And a young George W. Bush, then around 25, I was around 9, was all over that restaurant joking, my daddy and I are going to be president. In fact, he got right in front of me. And really with the demeanor, I described this on one of my radio interviews, George W. Bush at 25 was the most electrifyingly energetic person I've ever stood in front of. And he was laughing and joking and said to me, Andy, have you heard, my daddy and I are going to be president. So that must have been right around the time that they were informed that as father and son, they were both destined for the presidency, which was certainly as discombobulating as that news would have been to anybody, but certainly to also find out that your father is also going to be president in a short period of time must have certainly been a very shocking thing to learn, particularly when the people who are telling you are people like Dr. Harold Agnew, when he was the director of Los Alamos National Labs, literally the leading laboratory in the world for advanced applications in quantum physics. So certainly when George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush were approached by Project Pegasus and invited to that lunch, they must have knew that this was the real deal because they were dealing with some of the leading defense scientists in the country and the leading defense lab in the country. So they knew that it was the real deal and what they were being told was true. There was also an incident involving Bill Clinton's name coming up one time when we teleported. Sometimes when we would teleport back and forth between New Jersey and New Mexico, the stability of the Vortal tunnel created by the Tesla energetic array would begin collapsing. And so for safety's sake, we would be decanted to a location in Ohio. And that was a grassy, park-like field near the Swagelok headquarters in Solon, Ohio. And during one of those sort of decantings to Solon, one of the project people was walking with my father behind me as we went from the place where we had popped into view on the grass and walked around through the parking lot and into the middle front door of the Swagelok headquarters building. Now, Swagelok was basically a precision pipe fitting company. They made little joiners that are high fidelity sort of hose couplings for things like nuclear power plants and so forth. So it was basically a supplier to the defense industry. And this individual walking next to my father said, Ray, is it true that everybody in the project is saying that one of our next future presidents is going to be Bill Clinton? Tell me, is it true? And my dad said, yep, that's what they say. So that shows up an awareness by people in the project of the identity of Bill Clinton. Then we have my completely serendipitous meeting 10 years later in 1982 with the young Barack Obama. When I was a young college journalist at UCLA, I was pursuing my bachelor's degree in history. Obama was back in Los Angeles, he explained to me, hanging out with his friends at Occidental. But the reason I met him is I had had a conversation on Bruin Walk, where the political pamphleteering goes on the UCLA campus, with a young white South African advocate of the end of apartheid in South Africa, which was a political cause that Barack Obama espoused when he was an undergraduate. And we were talking about different issues in political economy and human rights. And I was narrating for him my recent interview of Buckminster Fuller, which took place in October of 1981. And he said, some of the ideas that Bucky Fuller shared with you are fascinating. I have a house guest right now who I'm sure would be interested in what he had to say, for example, about Pakistan. Fuller had said in his October 1981 interview with me as a college journalist that the CIA was raising an entirely mercenary army in Pakistan. And we know from the biography of Barack Obama that it was in 1981 that he traveled to Pakistan, despite the U.S. ban on traveling to Pakistan, because he possessed an Indonesian passport. So this ally of Barack Obama's, who was essentially on the UCLA campus as an outsider to lobby with students and other members of the UCLA community for divestment from the University of California from South African corporations, drove me in his Volkswagen Bug from Lot 6 there at UCLA, right near the bookstore and the West Center, and we drove to his apartment, which was right beyond the Wadsworth VA Center in West Los Angeles. And we went into a house. They were renting a house, and he said, I'll find my friend from Columbia. And when I stepped into the kitchen from the living room entry area there, Barack Obama entered from a downstairs bedroom, and we spoke for about a half hour. And we were primarily talking about the significance of the transnational corporations. What impact would they have on human society during our lifetime? Would they potentially enslave humanity in an oppressive technocratic nightmare, which was Buckminster Fuller's concern? Or conversely, could they be the vehicle for what Fuller was urging, that they would become the vehicle for economic liberation of human civilization on Earth? And Barack Obama and I, of course, are contemporaries. He was born a month before I was. He was born in August of 1961. I was born in September of 1961. We entered college the same year, which was the fall of 1979. And in fact, he transferred to Columbia after 2 years at Occidental to begin studies at Columbia in the fall of 1981, as I had been advised to do so by a CIA individual that they had placed in my life named Courtney M. Hunt. But I had declined that offer to do a campus transfer to Columbia and decided to continue to study at UCLA. But just as a result, I believe, of mere chance, here I find myself talking to somebody who had studied recently in Southern California, who had just spent a year as an undergraduate at Columbia after transferring there, and having gone to Pakistan at a time when an American citizen shouldn't have been able to. So espionage work on the part of Obama is presumed in terms of this trip to Pakistan that he took. But we really didn't discuss that. We really had kind of like something that fomented almost into an argument about the corporations, with me trying to share Fuller's ideas and Barack Obama taking a very conventional, almost Harvard lawyer's kind of take on the fact that, for example, corporations are necessary to allow people to participate in sophisticated economic activities and so forth. Now, our discussion fomented basically into an argument, and as Barack Obama was trying to sort of break away from the discussion, his friend from South Africa said, "You better be nice to him, Andy, because he's going to be president of the United States someday." And I treated it in a flippant way. I said something like, well, maybe we'll both pitch against each other in the final game of the World Series. And then Barack Obama broke away and started walking up the stairwell inside this house apartment they were staying in. And his friend from South Africa then turned to me and said, "No, you don't understand, Andy. We know he's going to be president." And when he said that, I looked up at Barack Obama as he was sort of unceremoniously, stalking away from the to avoid an argument with me. And he looked over at me and shook his head with a kind of a firm demeanor, which we've seen in public, where he kind of sticks his chin up in the air and shakes his head very authoritatively. So here I'm able to share something with the American people that I believe they have a right to know. And that is through direct personal experience of not only being on the U.S. time-space program, in which the technical capabilities emerged that would enable the intelligence community to do things like approach future presidents and inform them of their destiny. I had personal contact with both of the Bushes in 1971, and then with a college peer named Barack Obama in 1982, in which all three of them showed a consciousness of their destiny as president. So we can presume that because they had Jimmy Carter's identity, and they certainly knew that Bill Clinton would have essentially a long and successful presidency in the 90s as one of our youngest presidents of all time, we can presume that the other presidents since the early 1970s have been apprised in a similar way. So we're kind of stuck on the horns of a dilemma here, and that's why I've launched my Truth campaign. We are going to be needing technologies like teleportation as components of the global Marshall Plan that Al Gore has called for. Now, even if we disagree with Vice President Gore's views of global warming, I think we can all agree that with global population going from 6 billion human beings to 9 billion by 2045, we are going to have to find new ways simply to achieve global economic and environmental sustainability. I believe that one of those technologies is the very teleportation technology that emerged in Project Pegasus, but the problem is that our political leadership has been compromised by the same technology. The presidents have known years in advance that they're going to become president. And so that's why I'm speaking out, and I really am advocating two things here in the area of time travel. One is that the government begin acknowledging simply that they're in possession of teleportation. Because even if they don't explain to the world how it's achieved, in fact, in an age where we're threatened by terrorists, we probably would want to keep the how of teleportation secret. But we wouldn't want to keep secret its existence, nor our ability to use it to begin moving people and goods between distant locations on Earth. Because if we do that, we're going to be able to remove most of the transportation via plane, train, and automobile by which we move people and goods that is terribly polluting. Even if you disagree with the premise that it's causing climate change, it still is very polluting, full of toxic pollutants, and it's something that we want to remove from the biosphere. It's also, long-distance travel is also very, at this point, very congested. I mean, how many of us have practically been killed by 16-wheelers on America's highways?
It's true.
What if we got those 16-wheelers off the highways by teleporting those goods rather than shipping them via truck? So this is a multifarious reality. You don't have to agree with a major premise like climate change to say, wait a minute, let's evolve our transportation infrastructure because it'll remove the stress and fatigue from getting from one city to another. Look at the trip from London, England to Sydney, Australia. That's a 24-hour plane ride. Imagine being able to do that in seconds. Well, our capacity to do that in seconds has been available to the defense community since 1970, Curtis. And so, what is the morality of not implementing these technologies when we could have teleports at our major cities? For example, we could have Grand Central Teleport in New York City, and people could be jumping through different teleports to reach, for example, Union Teleport in Los Angeles. That would revolutionize life on our planet. We would solve problems more quickly. If there was a dispute, between, England and France, they wouldn't even have to take the shuttle. The diplomats could just jump through teleports and be talking to each other face to face. Or imagine how much more safe we would all be if rather than using teleportation to ship people, we simply used it to ship goods, and we continued to travel conventionally as human beings and just get all of that traffic from shipping goods off of our planes, trains, and automobiles. Okay, so that's why I'm speaking out. I think that there's a great potential to be grasped here in declassifying this teleportation technology and implementing it to advantage human life. But at the same time, I want my government to come clean and reestablish constitutional governance in the United States. This situation where presidents are informed of their destinies wasn't even imaginable by our framers, and yet it's a part of the guiding political reality that we now find ourselves in. So that's why I'm speaking out, and I thought today we might be able to distinguish the teleportation technology from the other quantum access technologies that were developed by Project Pegasus, because in advocating teleportation, I found that people have confused other experiences I had in quantum access with teleportation, particularly involving the distant past. And I just really want to distinguish those for your listeners so that we can get a grasp, really, of what Project Pegasus was doing and then how it ended up deriving, on the one hand, technologies that we could use to achieve planetary sustainability in the 21st century, and at the other time created a time gate that has undermined the integrity of American presidency.
Oh, yes. By all means, please.
Okay, well, I had my first experiences in Project Pegasus at age 6 in the 1967-68 time period. And that was sort of a one-off experience where my father and I jumped from the old Curtis Wright facility through a Tesla teleport to Santa Fe, New Mexico, which was always being used as the collection area of the project. And then we drove up to Los Alamos for a meeting with Dr. Harold Agnew. In that meeting, Dr. Agnew asked my father my age. The meeting was held for my dad to present a prospectus to involve civilians in the testing of the teleportation technology, the testing into the mental and physical effects of the experience of teleporting through a vortal tunnel in the time-space continuum, which is kind of like going through Lincoln Tunnel in New York City at about 10,000 miles per hour without 4,000 pounds of car wrapped around your waist. So at that meeting, Dr. Agnew asked my dad how old in reference to me, and my father and I answered simultaneously 6. And then my dad said, how was your trip? And my dad said, fine and fast. And Dr. Agnew looked up from the prospectus and said, oh, did you take the teleport? And my dad said, yep. And then he looked over at me and said, and so did my young son, Andrew. I think because my dad wanted to prove to Agnew that if teleportation was safe enough for his young son, it was safe enough for any child. Because my dad was definitely devoted to the notion that we should use teleportation for transportation around the world, which is the cause that I'm still honoring and carrying on in his name. And Agnew said, oh, did you take the teleport? And my dad said, yeah, and so did my son. And then there was a pause, and my dad said, have you tried it yet? And Agnew said, no, but I want to. And so I think we can infer from that discussion between one of the engineers on this project and somebody who was then the director of the weapons division, the W division at the Los Alamos National Labs, who several years later in 1970 would become the director of the labs and remain director throughout most of the 1970s, that teleportation, having been reduced to practice where a human being could jump through the device and survive, was sort of a new technical application in the defense labs of our nation. Because if it had emerged earlier, my dad wouldn't have been trying to prove its safety to Agnew, to school children at my age, and Agnew clearly would have already tried the device. But it was clearly a new technology that was emergent at that time, and we can also, that meeting with Agnew was also significant because we can use that to date when teleportation emerged, because that conversation had to take place between September of 1967 and September of 1968, because I was born in September of 1961. So I think that was an historical meeting, not just because it took place in the context of the actual time-space program at the time of its emergence, but because it allows us to date the fact that teleportation was a new technology during the 1967-68 time frame. But that was one of only 7 quantum access technologies that Project Pegasus was developing that I had direct experiences in. And in advocating for the declassification of teleportation as one of the technologies, this has kind of been submerged. So let me kind of go through the 7 forms of quantum access that that Pegasus was working on and kind of distinguishes. The first clearly was just conventional remote viewing. We were involved in just traditional remote viewing exercises for the United States Navy. We were highly psychically gifted children. In fact, we would play this card game called Concentration for, let's say, an hour or 90 minutes with 3 or 4 children. And every time the teacher put a standard 1 out of 52 playing cards to her forehead and concentrate what the card was and asked me to guess what she was concentrating on, we would play that for that much time, for 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 2 hours. And every time she came to me on a round-robin basis, I would get the color and suit, the number and suit of the card correct, which is 1 chance out of 52 over multiple draws, which is just astronomically high psychic performance. I had also been evincing special abilities around the household. For example, one time my father, who had a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering from Lehigh, certainly knew what the laws of physics were, came out of his carpentry shop in our cellar at our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, and saw me when I was about 3 levitating a happy jumble of some of my toys about 3 feet off the floor of our rec room, and was astonished, and I believe may have approached the U.S. Defense technical community about my abilities, because even going back 10 years before I was born, my dad had worked on some of the most sensitive aerospace projects in the country. For example, he was working in the metallurgy on the ramjet so that it wouldn't melt from friction in our atmosphere going back to 1951, 53 time frame. He had worked on the B-70, which was going to be the atomic strategic bomber of the U.S. Air Force. So I'm sure that with somebody with his engineering education and his ongoing work in classified defense-related research and development activities, and I could see from his reaction, my dad was utterly astonished by what he was seeing. So we were very bright children. We weren't geniuses by any means. We were simply just kids who were destined to get straight A's in school, you know. Yet we were highly psychically active, and many of us had special abilities, such as in my case the ability to, for example, go into the basement and read my dad's thoughts. I would frequently, when I was like, let's say, when I could talk, let's say to about age 7, I would go and walk down into the cellar when he was just thinking to himself and was doing his carpentry projects, and let's say complete what he was thinking. So I was reading minds, levitating things. I was telling my parents about things that were going to be in the New York Times the next day, and that kind of thing. So we were brought into the remote viewing program at the time of its emergence, and I think I can provide a new data point regarding that. The story of remote viewing in the United States that's been propagated since Jim Schnabel's book about the remote viewing program was published in 1989, embodied in all of the military viewers who have stepped forward, suggests that remote viewing emerged in 1972 with the program placed under Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff at Stanford Research Institute. That's not true. We were doing remote viewing for the Navy as early as the fall of 1969. Wow. And they've never talked about the use of psychically gifted children, and the Navy was working with us 3 years before the official timeline begins. So that's something that I can provide regarding the actual history of remote viewing. We were also placed on several very sensitive projects as child remote viewers for the Navy. One of the things we were asked to do, for example, was identify whether Lieutenant John McCain was in the Hanoi Hilton, and if he was in the building, where he was in the building. And they did that by showing us a blow-up of a photograph of a young Ensign McCain. I believe it was probably his Annapolis graduation photograph, or maybe his Ensign commission photograph, and a line drawing of what I believe now was the Hanoi Hilton. And they asked us to go home and dream about where John was being held by bad people somewhere in the world. They didn't tell us he was an American aviator who was a POW in Vietnam. They just showed us his picture, said his name was John, and asked us to go find him in the time-space continuum. Well, the next Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning, I and one of the girls from the project were literally jumping out of our seats to share with the facilitator and the officer from the Navy who were in the lab what we had seen in our lucid dreaming in the intervening week, which was that John McCain's captors had dug a hallway under the building and were keeping him in sort of a prison cell that was excavated into the earthen wall of this hallway under the building that could be seen from the ground. So that was the first form of time travel that we were involved in, which was remote viewing for the Navy. Now, why do I call that time travel? Well, because remote viewing is rudimentary time travel. The human mind is used to identify data held or going on somewhere else in the time-space continuum, whether it's in real time, is this official of the former Soviet Union sick right now, or occurring somewhere else on planet Earth in the past or future. It relies on the human mind to go and time travel and recover information. The second form of quantum access that they involved us in right there during the early days of the learning lab in 1969-70 was they were spinning us to induce out-of-body experiences.
Wow.
That is to say, they were placing us on our backs on tabletop-like devices that were being spun on a stylus. And I don't urge any of your listeners to try this, but I can't stop them from doing so if they choose to do so volitionally. If you lay on your back on a table like that and you're spun at 33 rotations per minute, I don't know if that's the significance of the 33 of Freemasonry. But
don't eat before you do that.
It very well may be the origin of the significance of 33. We also find it, of course, in the age that Jesus of Nazareth was when he was crucified. In any case, if you spin somebody at 33 rotations per minute clockwise and train them to look up at a spiral image on the ceiling and sort of soften their gaze and relax and go into sort of an astral state, they can be trained to pop out of their body and move through what the project was calling the matrix. Now, bear in mind that some of these terms have found their way into mass media because television shows and movies are used for disinformational purposes. In fact, science fiction was begun as a literary genre to obscure information from these secret defense projects that the United States launched during and after World War II. And so what happened was I would find myself popping out of my body and moving along this event horizon where all this information was moving ahead of me or above me forward and below me backward. In other words, it was sort of like racing towards some universal event horizon where all of the information in the quantum hologram was being sped through some kind of device at supersonic speed. So it's kind of like flying at a very great rate of speed in this strange technical environment. Well, when we would come back to our bodies, the team leader, who was a nurse at a local middle school, she was a health educator and Army nurse who was working at a local middle school. In fact, I have her name, but it's not important. She said, "What did you see when you were out of body, Andy?" And I said, "Well, I described how I kind of reached this limit where I couldn't go any higher or farther out of my body." And she said, "Well, what was there?" And I said, "Well, this device. It was like, like a movie player, like a motion picture camera that was projecting the entire quantum hologram." And she said, "So you think it was a machine, correct?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Yes, others are reporting that when they go out of body. We're calling it the matrix." Okay, so this is something that I can add to our popular, contribute to our popular culture. The concept of the matrix that's found in the phenomenal series of movies that began with the film The Matrix had its origins in these defense technical projects where they were doing things like spinning school children to go out of body. And I have to share that because, I was one of them. I went and visited the Matrix. It's there. And when I said, "Well, how could I go out of body and then come up against this machine?" And she said, "We think it's propagating the hologram that we find ourselves living in." So here we have a statement by a project participant in the U.S. time-space program at the time of its emergence, not a high-placed scientist or administrator, but simply a former Army nurse who was working at a local middle school as a health teacher, revealing to me that the program had concluded that the reality we're living in is a hologram being generated by a device, which is consistent with information that was later shared with me by Dr. Eldon Bird, one of the who passed away in 2002, but who at one time was one of the most highly placed civilian scientists employed by the United States Navy. And he shared with me his conviction and the conviction of the U.S. Navy that we're in fact living in a supraluminal artificial reality that's being generated by a machine, which is to say that when we go out on a starry night and look up at the luminous orb of the moon, we're looking at a holographic simulation of a planet. Now then you say, well, what happens when we go up and touch down on the moon? Well, we undergo this experience of touching down on the simulation. So this is one of the astonishing things that was discovered by Project Pegasus, and I have to share it with people because it really does recast the reality that we find ourselves in. William Shakespeare said, "All the world is a stage." Well, indeed it is. It's a stage being generated by a superluminal hologram, apparently designed by the creator to create the simulation of a physical reality that is nonetheless basically a three-dimensional dream or production that has apparently been generated for the benefit of the sentient creatures, the intelligent life forms that find themselves in the hologram. But it is an artificial reality. And so that was a form, I would say, of astral time travel. We were being prompted to spiritually leave our bodies and travel to the physical limits of the quantum hologram. The problem was that we couldn't visit the past and future very effectively through that modality because there was a physical limit to the reach of how far we could go within the quantum hologram. We were literally bumping up against the infrastructure that's generating the hologram that we find ourselves living in. But I think they were also doing the spinning simply to see which children could deal with the mind-bending effects of time travel. But we did that, I don't know, maybe about 10 or 20 times, and it was really the same thing that happened each time. I found myself blacking out briefly, popping out of my body, going up towards the ceiling, seeing myself pass through the, seeing the interior of the roof of the school, the attic, and just going up into space and then entering this alternate realm where ultimately the quantum hologram, reached a terminus. Very strange. I don't remember gathering much information about anything doing that. It was really just sort of a far-out astral experience that was prompted by being spun. Then after they had been spinning us, in the spring of 1970, they brought a device into the chair that I'm certain was the so-called Montauk chair. And that was the Montauk chair afforded the third form of quantum access that we were involved in. What it was a chair like a dental chair that had an umbrella over the head of the time traveler, a magnetic coil on the back of the chair, approximately behind where the solar plexus is of the person sitting in the chair. There was a cathode ray tube-like tube on a rocker arm, like a fishhook-shaped rocker arm, pointing back at the face of the time traveler. We were belted into the chair for reasons that escape me, presumably so we wouldn't leave the chair if it popped out of view. And they placed speakers, microphone headsets, and diodes on the outside of a cotton mask over our eyes, and we were urged to sit back and relax in the chair. Oh, by the way, there was also a computer processing unit, a CPU, under the chair, which is the first time I've heard the phrase CPU. And this is 1970, right? Okay. And the diodes on our eyes and the headset on our ears would generate a syncopated pattern of light flashes and sound tones. It was kind of a PBX or fax machine style set of tones. It kind of going like this, if I might try. It kind of went. So it was sort of a mathematically kind of arranged pattern of different electronic tones. And under the influence of those flashing lights and those sound tones, you would go into an astral state where we would find ourselves lifting out of our body physically from the chair. And then I experienced moving forward feet first and going through different wormholes in the amber-colored quantum plenum. And then we would go racing across this almost like a lake of black liquid. It was just shiny black surface. And we would see something on the horizon. And right after we identified something out there that we couldn't really make out on the horizon, we would collide with that object, and we would find ourselves in subjective episodes in our own futures. So this is what I can provide to the literature about the Montauk Project and the Montauk Chair. The Montauk Chair provides for a form of time travel. In my experience, that time travel was merely psycho-spiritual. It was simply transits to subjective 15 or 20-minute episodes in my own future. It wasn't time travel to different dimensions, planets, timelines. It was a way of pre-experiencing your own future. And then when we came back, we would wake up in the chair, and one of the nice ladies from DARPA would, gently ask us what we had seen of our own future, and then began asking questions to gather information from what we had seen. For example, if we said the television set was on, they would say, well, what was on the television set? And if we said, well, the President of the United States was giving a State of the Union address, they would say, well, who was the President, and what was he talking about? Okay, so they were using this form of psycho-spiritual to moments in the time traveler's own future to gather data about the future. Now, when I began investigating my experiences in Project Pegasus around the year 2000, I was really suspicious of the Montauk literature because it seemed to suggest that more de minimis technologies were used later in time. I knew that I had taken these journeys in the Montauk Chair, But the Montauk books of Nichols and Moon make of the Montauk chair, in a sense, the entire U.S. time-space program. So I could confirm some of their data. I knew the chair existed, and I knew that Jack Pruitt, Carl Jack Pruitt, a Navy veteran born in 1934, who I first met in the summer of 1967 during my initial contact with the project in New Jersey. He's a real person. I met him again in 2003 in Santa Fe. So I can confirm the data points, the existence of the chair, the reality of a person, Jack Pruitt, being on Project Montauk and Project Pegasus. But I was mystified why Nichols and Moon focused on such a kind of a rote measure technology, which wasn't the most advanced technology that was developed under Project Pegasus. At this point in time, though, I'd like to affirm their literature because I figured out what happened. If you look at the account that Nichols and Moon provide, they talk about, for example, that many of the Montauk boys died when they were in the chair. Now, none of us died in the chair. We simply went on these astral projections psychospiritually to moments in our own future. It was virtually non-violent and safe. And so I've listened to the accounts of individuals like Stuart Swerdlow, certainly Preston Nichols and Peter Moon's books, and the accounts of other Montauk experiencers are beginning to come forward. And I realized that what must have happened is after Project Pegasus ended, because the Montauk chair provided for a form of time travel where the time traveler essentially, their body remained back in the laboratory. The Montauk project must have been a one-off project to do everything possible that they could think of with the Montauk chair, to try to boost the performance of the Montauk chair. For example, the deaths that occurred would be explainable, that occurred according to Nichols and Moon or Stuart Swerdlow in the context of the Montauk project, would be explainable if, for example, they were irradiating the chair when somebody was time traveling to their own future. We know from the account that Nichols and Moon provide that the Montauk chair was used to tap other dimensions and to send people to Mars and so forth. That's not how it was being used when I was on Project Pegasus, but just because it wasn't, I have to be fair to them and say, as we say in the law, evidence of absence doesn't connote absence of evidence. And conversely, absence of evidence doesn't connote evidence of absence. Just because I can't confirm their evidence doesn't mean their evidence is invalid. What must have happened is that Montauk must have been a one-off attempt to simply take that form of quantum access and explore its potential, involving even doing dangerous things with Montauk teleportees. In other words, with where the chair could take somebody. That must have involved drugging, undoubtedly, because they were injecting us with radionuclides to achieve invisibility. They were probably injecting the project participants with different substances, irradiating the room where the chair was. We know from the human radiation experimentees literature that was surfaced under Dr. Ruth Fadden when President Clinton formed the Human Radiation Advisory Committee in 1993, that there was extensive involvement in the effects of radiation on adults and children during the Cold War. And that, I think, explains this apparent discrepancy between how I view the Montauk chair and the entire literature of Project Montauk. I think it was an attempt to push the envelope so far in terms of what the Montauk chair could achieve that the Montauk literature could very well be as valid as my own. And I just want to sort of extend apologies to Stuart and to Preston and to Peter and others who have advanced the Montauk literature, because I've been rather late in the game in figuring that out, and I can't refute their data. I think, in fact, the more I explore it, I have to conclude that the Montauk project was branched off from Project Pegasus and really was simply a project where they were focusing on the human and technical potentialities of the chair. So I don't in any way want to be viewed as refuting their data. Because I can confirm the existence of the chair, in fact, travel to my own future in it, and I certainly can confirm the existence of who they identify as the research director for Project Montauk, somebody who I know was a team leader on Project Pegasus, namely Jack Pruitt. I just want to go on the record publicly as stating that I can confirm major elements of their story and now believe that, in fact, the two projects were directly related. So that was the third form of quantum access. You basically send that I experienced. You send somebody to moments in their own future. I remember one time I saw myself living in Seattle at around age 50, and my wife asked me why, if I felt ill. And she said, well, why don't you lay down here on the couch and take a nap? And she got me a blanket. and then I woke up as an 8-year-old in the chair in New Jersey. So it was somewhat psychologically de-rasking. You basically visited moments in the future, like in an enhanced deja vu experience, and then, feverish and dehydrated, you woke up, a couple minutes later in a chair back in your childhood. So this is why they needed bright, psychically active children who had already sort of tapped the non-ordinary realm of human experience with their own spiritual experiences, because some of the cognitive dissonance between where we were being sent and then being returned to our childhoods in New Jersey was very abrupt, and we really had to deal with these changes of timelines like that. But that was the third form. I call it psychospiritual, and basically the Montauk chair clearly was an example of that. The fourth kind of quantum access that they involved us in beginning in fall of 1970 were this form of virtual time travel with a physical component, or I call it virtual time travel with physical ramifications. And that occurred in the context of holograms that we would stand in these devices called chronovisors. A chronovisor is a device that was developed by two Vatican musicologists, Pellegrino Ernetti and Pier Maria Gemelli, working at the Catholic University of Milan in Italy in the 1940s, and then later with the distinguished Italian physicist Enrico Fermi. And they discovered it accidentally while they were developing a specialized microphone to split the signals in Gregorian chants. They were musicologists studying the harmonic patterns in Gregorian chants that, among other things, produce a sense of spiritual bliss and even physical healing. And to their astonishment, something that Gemelli's father had said to him in childhood came through the microphone. His father had a nickname for Gemelli, which was zucchini, little cucumber. And that came through the microphone, and they realized they had created essentially a portal to a past event. So working with Fermi, by 1952, they had a two-dimensional chronovisor, which creates a sort of a television image of a past event. I saw one of those images when I first encountered the chronovisor technology. We were taken to a national security watch post in Flemington, New Jersey, and at that location I was shown a TV-like screen in which the actual signing of the U.S. Constitution was being broadcast. And the technician sitting at that console pointed to the screen and pointed to George Washington standing on the dais and a very corpulent and brilliant-looking Benjamin Franklin with a huge head sitting on a sofa in the audience, in the gathering. I couldn't make out Washington. He looked rather thin and not as august as he was portrayed in his paintings, but I could clearly recognize Benjamin Franklin, not only as Franklin, but as somebody who had a head that was about twice as big as everybody else in the room, and a body that was very large as well. So Franklin was clearly distinguishable as Benjamin Franklin, but I was frustrated that I couldn't really make out Washington. So we know from the literature of the chronovisor that Gemelli went to his death in 1994, claiming that by 1952, that team under Fermi had recovered two-dimensional images of the crucifixion of Jesus. And at the Sandia National Labs in summer of 1972, I saw a 16-millimeter black and white documentary of a hologram in which Jesus could be seen being crucified, and things were occurring in the scene that were consistent with the gospel accounts of his crucifixion. Women coming to pray at the foot of his crucifix and then being chased away by the Roman centurions. I saw one of the centurions leap literally up to the toes on one of his feet and holding the bottom of the handle of his lance to pierce Jesus' side. So that must have been the Roman centurion Longinus hastening Jesus' death by piercing his side as he was being crucified. It was horrific to watch, but I tell it not to influence anybody's religious beliefs, but simply to affirm that the statement made by the very honorable Father Ernetti, who was a very respected and honorable Catholic prelate, and Gemelli, who would donate money to create the largest Catholic hospital in Rome, two very positive and constructive human beings. I'm bearing witness to Father Ernetti's claim, and I'm honoring his memory by stating that, yes, his claim is valid because I saw a film of that hologrammatic projection. It may have been, in all likelihood, it was captured later, but it was captured with the same technology, and I can affirm his claim that the crucifixion of Jesus was filmed after being captured holographically. When we came out of that viewing in Sandia, my father said to Connie Chavez, who was our guest, "I don't know why you're reacting like the way you are," because she said, "Ray, because they were crucifying my Lord." And she's a very devout Catholic. And I guess I know, Connie, but we have footage that 3 days later, there's a bright flash of light in the crypt. Jesus stands up, and two angels help him push the rock away. So I can't confirm through direct eyewitness testimony footage of the resurrection of Jesus, and of course that's utterly controversial in terms of its religious significance. But I can bear witness to the truth of the fact that my father stated that they also had footage of the resurrection. So at least that gives me pause to consider, basic spiritual formulations. So they had this two-dimensional technology. When I was brought into the project in 1970, it had already been modeled into 3- and 4th-dimensional chronovision. So let me just describe the chronovisor location at Morristown, New Jersey. Inside an historical building there, they had an auditorium. There was a stage in the front of the auditorium, just like a college music hall would have. Above the stage, there was a device called a crystal array. It was basically an octagonal device that would generate the hologram. We were told to look up at it when it wasn't turned on, because if we looked at it when it was turned on, we would become blind. So they trained us to literally, they sort of like practiced to make sure we didn't look up at the light when it was on. In the front of the stage was about 3 feet from the lip of the stage, the edge of the stage, was a blue line on the floor, which was the front edge of the hologram, and it would turn it on. And we were told that if we were beyond that blue line, we would experience being in that past or future event when the hologram was turned on. Well, what was the hologram? The hologram was a dense field of light that was so dense that among its capabilities was the ability to bend the fabric of time-space and bring a non-local event into the laboratory. So in other words, everything that has happened, is happening in the universe, or will happen in the universe, can be accessed by creating an energy field where you identify either the residual or the latent or present or latent signal of that event, amplify it, and bring it into a holographic rendering in your time. Well, when they did that, they found that certain quantum paradoxes occurred. If you stood outside the hologram, you basically saw a very enchanting form of moving light, basically three-dimensional cinema, like a cube of depicting a past scene. However, if you stood within the hologram, you experienced being in that time and place. And in fact, if we were more than 15 minutes in the hologram, they had to insert this portal into the hologram to extract us. So there was a physical dimension to the immersions in the holograms produced by the chronovisors. For example, I was sent to Holland around the year 1800, and I was pulled out of an irrigation ditch by this farm woman, and she walked me down to her house, which was no fancier than a barn with a large table in it. And she served me some gruel. It was sort of a soup with like turnips and onions in it. Not bad, actually. It was a pretty good onion soup. And over time, the whole village started ending up coming to her house. So I'm sitting there at this table, looking out the door, wondering when they're going to insert the portal into the scene. And there's like 20 Dutch villagers looking at me with this male elder from their village, coming up to me every 20 minutes or so, going, "Yinglish?" They must have thought I was a British lad who had fallen into the ocean and come over across the British Channel to the Netherlands and found their way into their irrigation ditch. I don't speak Dutch, but I'm fairly sure that that's what they were asking me. So finally, after nightfall, I saw the portal form outside the barn, and I ran out and jumped through it and got back to the present. The reason I'm citing that example is because I drank that soup. So it wasn't just a virtual reality where I found myself in a holographic simulation of Holland in 1800. I was there enough physically to consume a beverage. Now, that's not what Jack Pruitt told us would happen when we were trained on the chronovisor beginning there in fall of 70. He said that we would be able to see and be seen in the past events we were going to be sent to, But from our perspective, we were only a spectral presence in their time-space environment. And he used the example of a ghost in our time-space location. The notion that a ghost can be sort of an overlap of an image of somebody who's living in another timeline. And that's certainly consistent with the ghost literature because, as you probably are aware of, many of the ghost sightings that have been seen in urban areas, frequently the ghost is seen with the bottom of their legs under the ground because, let's say, the surface of a road has been raised in the intervening centuries. Or maybe a ghost will go through a wall that wasn't there in their time. So we believe from the ghost literature that ghosts may be spectral presences where there's a quantum overlap between two timelines. That's what Jack Pruitt said would happen when we were in the holograms produced by the chronovisor. But I'm speaking out now because I believe the chronovisors achieved a form of physical time travel, which is fraught with implications. It means we can literally engineer the past and the future by sending somebody there to physically change events. And I'm asked that question all the time by people who write me at my Facebook site. You know, what were the chronovisors actually doing? Were you actually physically going there? Well, we were told we were only going to be a spectral presence there like a ghost, but unfortunately I can prove from the different memories of even staying at one location for 3 nights, or 2 nights and 3 days actually, which was the Five Points neighborhood of New York City around the turn of, around the year 1900, that I was even sleeping overnight at some of the locations. But then when we get back to the chronovisor array in Norristown, I'd say to one of the technicians, how much time passed? And they'd say, oh, Andrew, about 15 minutes. So there was some kind of quantum paradox involving time dilation that was occurring when we were in the chronovisors, and we were clearly, a density effect was occurring, and we were clearly in those locations enough to, eat, drink, sleep, and I guess theoretically be injured or be trapped there. But happily I wasn't, and I lived to tell the tale. Now, beginning with my first experiences in 1967, the fifth form of quantum access I know was physical teleportation because we were literally leaping from New Jersey and New Mexico and back, and that was the teleport device that was at the old Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey. I know from everything I overheard and was trained in on the project, that I was educated in as one of the gifted and talented American school children on Project Pegasus, that the teleportation device they were working with had been found in Nikola Tesla's papers at his apartment in Manhattan at the time of his death on January 9th of 1943, and were seized by 2 War Department agents who were racing 2 FBI agents to get to Tesla's residence and seize his paperwork under the Alien Property Forfeiture Act, which was a law passed by Congress to enable the War Department to seize the documents of resident aliens in the United States to potentially sequester any military secrets that might be in their paperwork. So because Tesla had been born a Serbian in Croatia, I don't believe he had achieved citizenship. He may have. But in any case, they used that act to basically sequester his paperwork. Where did they send it? They sent it where they should have sent it, where it was logical to send it. They sent it to Los Alamos, New Mexico, because that's where some of the world's brightest minds in quantum physics were then gathering to build the atomic bomb under Project Manhattan. Unfortunately, that's where Tesla's papers still remain. One of the reasons I'm speaking out is because the works of this great immigrant American scientist, Nikola Tesla, have been weaponized. They were weaponized during World War II, and they've been kept back from humanity because they're stored under conditions of great secrecy at the Los Alamos National Labs. And an engineer or a scientist needs to be provided the right security clearance to visit Lanel and read Tesla's paperwork. Tesla's name was coming up all the time when I was on the project. My own father, who I dearly loved, he was a great man and a great father, once said to me in a conversation, and for that matter, a great educator. I mean, he was always trying to educate me in what was going on in the project. I had a sort of a special advantage that way as his son, as one of the kids on the project. We were having lunch in Albuquerque, and he asked me what I had heard of Tesla and asked me to explain who Tesla was. And then he said, most of what we're doing on the project owes to the contributions of Nikola Tesla. Well, here it is, Curtis. It's 2010. Tesla died, what was that, 67 years ago, 3 generations ago? And we find that the papers of this brilliant immigrant American inventor remain weaponized. They remain national security secrets. Well, how are we going to invent the infrastructure of the 21st century if that continues? I mean, during the meet and greet that Donald Rumsfeld, not Ronald McDonald, Donald Rumsfeld gave, I'm getting ahead of myself, forgive me, but during the lecture that Donald Rumsfeld gave the child teleportees, including myself, in the spring of 1971, I believe it was April of 1971, at the amphitheater. There was an underground amphitheater that you can see from the surface now because there was a fire that consumed the roof of the basement level roof or ground floor of that facility at the Cerrillos Cultural Center compound in Cerrillos, New Mexico. Rumsfeld stated the significance of the teleportation technology is military. It's going to allow us to put troops precisely where they're needed on the battlefield, because our defense analysts found in analyzing World War II that the majority of American deaths and injuries in battle were caused by accidents and friendly fire and sniping and so forth as our troops were getting to the front line, not at the front line where they could use their weapons and train their weapons on the enemy. So they sequestered teleportation as a military secret, and that has been a global mistake. We could have been jumping between major cities 40 years ago with this technology. So I feel, as a human being, as somebody who is sworn to uphold the oath of, the Constitution of the United States, and somebody who, I've striven mightily to educate myself and participate in the great debate that's going on, about the crisis of the environment and development that we find ourselves in. I mean, as I said, even if you disagree with the major premises of an Al Gore, we're still dealing with the challenge of overpopulation, with this tremendous growth in human population. Even if it's not overpopulation, it's still 3 billion more people that we're going to have to house and move around the planet and so forth, educate, feed. So we're going to need the state-of-the-art in terms of our technical development. But as long as teleportation remains secret, we're not going to have access to that state-of-the-art transportation technology. So I think it's morally incumbent on me to speak out and articulate the fact, share the fact with others, that teleportation has already been achieved. It was achieved in DARPA's Project Pegasus, and Donald Rumsfeld, who was destined to become Defense Secretary under Presidents Ford and George W. Bush, was the defense attaché to the project. So I've called publicly on Coast to Coast AM back on November 11th of 2009 for the two individuals who went furthest in the political system, Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico and former Defense Secretary Donald Henry Rumsfeld, to step forward and acknowledge one fact, not everything that the project did, not all the secrets that it contained, but one technical truth, and that is that teleportation has already been achieved. We should not be wasting the lives of current investigators and their careers, nor billions of dollars reinventing teleportation, because it's sitting at Los Alamos. In all likelihood, it's being used at the presidential level to move the president and the first family and so forth around the planet. I've heard anecdotal accounts, possibly apocryphal, but nonetheless claims that there's a teleport at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas, that is used to take the president and first family to Pine Gap in Australia to take part in state visits to that distant country. And so I believe everybody on the planet has a human right to enjoy the state-of-the-art for technical development that human beings have invented. And hence I'm calling for Richardson and Rumsfeld to man up and do what's honorable and do what is their duty as American citizens and join my truth campaign and simply affirm that this technology exists, it needs to be declassified, and it holds tremendous potential for rebuilding and innovating how we move people around the world during the 21st century. I had about maybe about 40 jumps back and forth between New Jersey and New Mexico during those years. By the fall of 1970, they were involving us in offsets of time. And when we were physically traveling this way, they could only jump us within the ambit of the system. In other words, we were jumping through the device in New Jersey. We had to jump home to get back to our real-time time-space reference via an identical device at the Sandia National Labs. So when I talk about going to the time of the dinosaurs or going to see Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address, those were not teleportations. Those were more or less quantum immersions achieved by different technologies.
Ah.
A more advanced teleporter in the sixth form of quantum access was the Stargate device that was located at the gymnasium, at the Cerritos Cultural Compound again. And we used that to reach the year 2045. We were retrieving data scrolls of intervening events. These were sort of microfilmed summaries of future events from the perspective of the early 70s, as prepared by project historians that we were meeting in 2045, or actually aides to them that we were meeting in 2045. We would jump through a teleport that was recessed in the wall of a conference room at that facility and pop into view in the grounds immediately surrounding the microwave tower that's at the Lovo Overlook site immediately west of the Continental Divide sign on Highway 160 in southwest Colorado. It was explained to us that that microwave tower was putting beacons out into the time-space continuum that Project Pegasus was using in 2045 to be able to put us back in the time in the early 70s we had left. Whatever. November, X, 1971, April 17th, 1972, whatever, when the time we had left. Which is really amazing, and it also shows why some of these advanced microwave facilities have been built around the country. The public has spent the billions of dollars to manufacture and put them in place, but it's been concealed that, in fact, they're part of the time-space program. At least some of them are. They're putting out beacons, just as a lighthouse would put out a light beacon to protect a ship from hitting a shoal. Some of these microwave towers the Defense Department has put up around the country and the world are putting sonic beacons out into the universe, out into the time-space continuum, so that the project members in the future can identify specifically our location in time-space. And then the final technology or form of quantum access that I was exposed to after the Stargate in Project Pegasus was a device called a plasma confinement chamber. It was a glassine box made out of sort of lucite that was about the size of a tennis court, maybe about half as wide as a tennis court. And we were trained we would enter this box of plastic or glass, and we would walk across it, inside of it, and after we crossed a certain line, we would become immersed in a field of plasma that was under confinement. That's what they call the plasma confinement chamber. It wasn't confining us, it was confining the plasma. And when we were walking towards that plasma, I was always amazed at how beautiful it was. It had sort of this opalescent sheen where you could see different pastel colors kind of flickering in the gas, or plasma rather. But then when we walked into the plasma field, something quite frightening happened. The bottom dropped out of the floor, and we found ourselves suddenly wormholing through multiple branching tunnels in the time-space continuum. They literally could control a field of plasma and create, I believe they were creating a localized quantum effect around us, a quantum field effect that had some kind of magnetic or other effect that allowed our bodies, our physical matrix, to access another location in the quantum hologram. I don't know what they were doing. I'm sharing the information about this form of time travel because I experienced it, and I'm astonished at the control they had in terms of the specificity of where they could send us in light of the fact that they were essentially manipulating a field of plasma. They clearly must have been able to calibrate certain characteristics of the plasma under confinement to send us where they were sending us with such specificity. But we were only experiencing that plasma field and this bizarre, violent wormholing effect when we were being sent somewhere. Because then, when we were in that location they sent us, the effect would wear off and we would have like this massive Kundalini sensation, I would feel myself perfused with this sort of like field of energy or stimulation that would cause you to sort of half black out with this immense pleasure sensation going on in your head and body. And you were sort of absorbed by it or in it. And then I would find myself back in the plasma confinement chamber in East Hanover, New Jersey, which, by the way, I'm going to be coming forward publicly about the fact that which scientist was administering that device in East Hanover. He's still alive. In fact, I tried to visit him during my 2008 trip to New Mexico, but his wife refused to let me talk to him, which was kind of strange. If my story was apocryphal, you'd think they would have just enjoyed a tall story. but she said that my husband is not going to discuss anything involving classified work. After I mentioned that I'd been on the project and that he had been the administrator, operator of this plasma confinement chamber. But the only journey to the past or future that I remember via that device was that I was sent to a road north by northwest of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on November 19th, 1863. They dressed me as a Union bugle boy after my father and the project scientist who was at that location asked me whether I wanted to see Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. And after a few weeks of hesitation, I agreed, and they dressed me as a Union bugle boy, actually in a very immaculate Union bugle boy uniform. I felt kind of like I just put on my Sunday suit when I came out of the dressing room. And I think I actually went, ta-da, to my dad, shiny black shoes. It was a pretty cool uniform, for a 10-year-old from New Jersey. And I, born in 1961, 100 years after the Civil War began. And so I found myself, as my father had explained, on this road that they knew was north by northwest. In fact, there was a north-south arterial that went right through Gettysburg, and then it branched off into this road that went due northwest from that location. And so they dropped me down there because they instructed me to walk along that road until I could get directions from somebody to see if I was traveling in the right direction to travel into Gettysburg. And I found out that I was. But when I arrived there, after this violent wormholing, my hat was gone, and both of my shoes and one of my socks had been ripped off in all that violent wormholing in the quantum plenum. And so I sat down and pulled off my other sock and threw it in the bushes because I didn't want to attract attention to myself, just walking to town with one sock. So I walked in barefoot. I mean, it was November 19th, okay, so it was fairly brisk. And I was shivering. My teeth were actually chattering as I walked into downtown Gettysburg. And I began to go up on those old wooden sidewalks they had where they'd have like 3 shops next to each other in the same building. And they'd have a wooden sidewalk in the front, and then there'd be a gap between the other buildings where there wouldn't be any sidewalk. So I was so cold that I walked up on the sidewalk, and I was looking into the shops, hoping that I would find a shopkeeper who could let me in and, give me a jacket or give me some soup or something, because I was cold. It was about a mile walk, in very cold November, very cold November morning. Fairly cold. And, but I was pretty inert to that growing up in New Jersey, but I clearly should have had a jacket on at least. So I'm looking through the windows of a millinery shop, which is a men's accessory. And a man severely limping gambled up onto the sidewalk. And he was yelling at me. He was saying, he wasn't chasing me away from the store. He was saying, he was concerned about me. He said, boy, what are you doing out here in this November air without your jacket or even shoes on your feet, lad? You're going to catch your grip. Come on inside. I'll get you some shoes and a jacket. Now, I've identified that man. He was a Gettysburg cobbler named John Lawrence Burns. I've identified him photographically as a result of remembering encountering him during this probe to Gettysburg via plasma confinement. Now, this is one of the internal proofs to my story, Curtis, and let me share this with your listeners because I hope they'll appreciate what I'm saying. When I first told my Gettysburg story, which is a true story, it's not fiction, it's a factual experience. That's my position. Make no mistake. I described what this man looked like, how he hopped up onto the sidewalk, how he was severely limping as if he had been shot in the leg, pretty high in the leg near the hip, because he was kind of walking almost in a crab-like way, as if he had been shot in the upper thigh, and that he had a key to a store that had men's shoes in it, and that he not only voluntarily helped me, he eagerly helped me. He made it his business on a cold November morning to accost me and take that key and enter a shop, presumably when he shouldn't have been, because he later had an encounter with the woman who was running the store. Now, what do we know about John Lawrence Burns? We know the following. This is what I found out when investigating him. I did not know these facts when I described the encounter with this individual, this very kind, helpful, and yet injured human being. I found out that when John Lawrence Burns was a young man, I think he was still a teenager, even younger, he was one of the first volunteers for the War of 1812. I also found out that when the Battle of Gettysburg moved through and near his town, the Battle of Gettysburg kind of swept through a part of Gettysburg, but also was carried out in the land beyond the town proper, that John Lawrence Burns, who was a Gettysburg cobbler, volunteered as a sharpshooter into the Union Army, was wounded in the upper leg, was captured by the Confederates, and surrendered back to the Union troops under a flag of surrender because he was an old man, and he used the excuse that he just wandered onto the battlefield and been accidentally injured. Now think of the chivalry of that. The Confederates were being shot at by this man, but he was hit by them and he was wounded, and they clearly could have executed him on the battlefield as an enemy combatant. But they surrendered him back to the Union troops. He was then brought to safety in Gettysburg, treated, and by the time I met him 4 months after the Gettysburg battle, he was limping just as a man would who was injured in that part of his leg. He also voluntarily helped me. Well, who was this human being? He was somebody who, as both a young lad and as a man in his 60s or older, had volunteered into two of America's most important battles, the War of 1812 and the Union cause during the American Civil War. What was his profession? Well, he was a cobbler. Well, what key did he have? He had a key to a millinery shop in downtown Gettysburg that had men's shoes in it. In fact, he took me to the back of the first room of the shop, and there on the back wall were shelves all the way from the floor to the ceiling with both new and used men's shoes. He grabbed a pair of, size 14 brown men's street shoes, and for about 10 minutes was stuffing packing tape, or 5 minutes, taking them on and off my feet, and he was stuffing more and more packing paper into the front of the shoes so that I could wear them. Then, once I had the shoes on, which were grossly oversized, he then took me to the storeroom behind the shop, and there was a stack of about 40 men's jackets, most of them Union, blue. And he reached into the stack and pulled out a very nice winter parka and said, "Look, this looks like your size. Why don't you put it on, son?" And he put it on me, and I was warm. Now, think of the data points here that I could not have made up. I had already narrated the story before I learned. I had revisited my memory of visiting Gettysburg and talked about this man who accosted me while I was looking through this men's accessory shop. And then I later found that I identified him by photograph. I identified that he was of a volunteering spirit his entire life, just as he voluntarily hopped up on that sidewalk and evinced compassion for apparently a young bugle boy who was probably separated from his regiment and was barefoot and starving and shivering in the brisk November air. He was a cobbler, and I identified where his wound was. Now, if you think of the specificity of people in Gettysburg at that time, how could it not have been that man? He was an elderly cobbler who had access to a men's shop that had shoes in it, who was wounded in the very location that John Lawrence Burns was, we know from historical record, and I've identified his appearance. Okay, so he then said, "Son, I can't help you anymore. Mr. Lincoln's going to be here today. I've got a presidential speech to see." So he hobbled out of that shop towards the dais over near the cemetery where Lincoln was going to be expected to be arriving from the Wills Hotel. And I ran after him because that's why I was there. I was there to see the Gettysburg Address. That's why my father and the project scientist had sent me to Gettysburg. And I thought, great, this guy's now going to take me to the speech site. So I followed after him, but I had difficulty walking because I was shuffling along like a little boy standing in his father's grossly oversized slippers. I could hardly walk in these humongous shoes. I walked over to the dais. Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address on about a riser that had it was simply a rectangular dais or riser that was about 3 feet off the ground and about maybe 20 feet deep and maybe 80 feet across, or maybe a little bit larger with this patriotic bunting around it. And I initially stood over by the left corner of the dais, just hoping that Lincoln would show up, trying to look inconspicuous. There were by then maybe about 20 citizens present, a few Union officers. And these ladies dressed in their Sunday best were standing over on the left side past me, looking over at me and kind of gossiping about me behind their fans. I don't know why they were. It may have been what I was wearing. I might have looked like a Union bugle boy, separated from his regiment. I might have looked like a local kid who had scavenged some Union clothing from the battlefield, which certainly would have been a dishonorable thing to do. They might have thought I was a carpetbagger coming in from another state. But they were gossiping about me, and because we were always trained, we were trained to always avoid public scrutiny when we were in a past or future event, I then walked to the front of the dais. And standing there, dressed as a Pennsylvania farmer, was my dad. And I said, I had just seen him back at the plasma confinement chamber, back at the Time Lab in East Hanover, New Jersey. And I turned to him, I said, Dad, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be back in New Jersey. And he looked at me and said, I'm not your son, boy. Excuse me, what I'm saying. I'm not your father, boy. You're not my son. In other words, he declaimed the fact that I was his son. And I just called him Dad, right? And acted like he didn't know me. Okay, and that was extremely frightening. Because I thought, okay, what the hell is going on here? So my thoughts are racing. My heartbeat starts beating faster. I'm thinking, wait a minute. I'm in Gettysburg in 1863. That's my dad. He's dressed in overalls. He wasn't supposed to be here. And now he's saying he doesn't know who the hell I am. So those were the kind of, I don't know how to describe it, quantum complications that sometimes caused me to really become, consternated when I was time traveling. So I kind of thought to myself, well, I better not pester him because he says he's not my dad, but maybe it's a man who looks like my dad. Okay, so you can imagine how a 10-year-old is going to respond to his father literally saying, son, I'm not your father. I don't know exactly what he said, but he certainly declaimed, precisely the words he used, but he declaimed that he was my dad. So I thought, okay, that's something I better, react to properly. So I then walked back and kind of hovered behind my dad for a couple of minutes, and then I again walked over on the left side of the dais thinking that if indeed it was my father, again, because of my training, I thought I better make myself scarce and not be near him, because there may be a reason for him to be planted in this location to see President Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. So as I was standing again over on the left side of the dais, I was essentially approached by two Union officers who were literally hovering there right at the left corner of the dais. One was this very handsome officer in a mustache who had his arm on the corner of the dais and was just sort of looking back and forth, looking at the crowd. And the other was a much more homely individual who had stubble on his face. He was ill-shaven, and he was eating an apple by paring it with a penknife and flipping the wedges of apple into his mouth. And with a mouthful of apple, even with apple juice kind of dribbling from the corner of his mouth, he got right in my face and said, "Boy," he said, "Where's your regiment, boy?" And I said, "I don't know, sir." And he said, "You don't know where your regiment is?" And I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Well, where are they bivouacked, son?" And I said, "What does bivouac mean?" And then he turned to the other officer and then came back in my face and said, "You don't know what bivouac means?" And I said, "No, I don't know, sir. Sorry." And then he turned to the guy again. They really were becoming concerned about who I was, why I was dressed as a Union bugle boy, but didn't know where my regiment was, couldn't identify bivouac. And then he leaned forward and said, "Boy, are you touched in the head a little bit? Have you seen a little bit too much of a fight?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And then they laughed. They practically fell over laughing. And I can forgive them for that because these guys had just seen, two years of brutal battle. They probably had become pretty inured to violence, and even the death of child participants in the Civil War, the death of bugle boys and drummer boys like I was dressed. But they found it hysterical, and then kind of we just waved his hand as if I could go. But they were really questioning me to try to find out who I was. And that deeply concerned me because, again, we were always, we were trained to always avoid being questioned, accosted. That's even why John Lawrence Burns approached me on the sidewalk disturbed me. I was just going along because he had invited me into the millinery shop. Usually I would just try to say something to get away from an adult like that. Then the women were gossiping about me, I could see, and Union officers questioned me. So I was really concerned that I was going to, something was going to happen that we've been trained to avoid, like being detained, being confined in a limited space, being arrested, being placed in a jail cell. Jack Pruitt had gone over all the situations we were supposed to avoid because they didn't want us stuck somewhere where, for example, they couldn't send a portal in to extract us from one of these locations in the past if they had to, or send somebody there to rescue us. They didn't want a confrontation with authorities in the past who might, for example, be jailing us. Okay. So essentially my survival training was prompted, and I decided to walk diagonally away from the dais about 100 paces and stand with my back to the dais and look in the opposite direction from where I knew Lincoln would soon be arriving on the dais from the Wills Hotel. And I put my left foot forward and my right foot to the right so that anybody who looked over at me wouldn't see that I was a 10-year-old dressed in size 14 or so men's shoes, that I was a Union bugle boy with a winter parka on, John Lawrence Burns had also provided me another Union hat, or some kind of cap. I don't think it was exactly the classic Civil War hat. It was more of, I guess, maybe a winter cap or something like that. And I looked to my right in that odd posture with my feet, with these grossly oversized shoes on, and it was in that odd body posture that I was photographed by a photographer that I never even saw when I was there. Because in 1951, 10 years before I was born, a Civil War photograph surfaced. When it was analyzed, they found a few pixels in the back of the crowd scene that showed Abraham Lincoln either sitting down or standing up after either arriving on the dais to give his speech, or after about ready to give the Gettysburg Address, or after just giving it. I can confirm that those images of Lincoln were taken right after he arrived on the dais and sat down, because I had just left the dais when I walked those 100 paces and was captured in the foreground of that photograph. One of the astonishing things that I learned after I served in Project Pegasus, I learned it first shortly after I served when I found that photograph in a news magazine, is that my trip to Gettysburg in 1863 was captured in that photograph that also captured President Lincoln right before he gave the Gettysburg Address. And that is to say that what until 2008 would be the only known photograph to capture President Abraham Lincoln at the location of the Gettysburg Address is also the first photograph to capture a time traveler from the future, and I was that time traveler. So that was an example of a trip that I reached via, I went on via plasma confinement, and maybe we can just end there because that really, I think, was the most extraordinary thing that happened to me on the project, was that in accessing 1863, documentary evidence was produced that showed my presence there. My father affirmed, shortly after I found that photograph, I took the news magazine to him and I said, "Look, Dad, they got a picture of me when you sent me to Gettysburg." And he said, "Yes, I know. Just don't talk about it." So, you know, those are the 7 forms of quantum access that I was involved in, and I'd be happy to take any calls from your listeners to explain any of what I've just described. But that really is becoming sort of the iconic picture of my experiences, because I didn't see the photographer, but by doing what I did, what I'd been told to do, which is avoid arrest, I went through the pangs of regret that I didn't see Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. But what I did in response to that environment in the past caused me to be part of the photograph in a very conspicuous way, and it now enables us to establish that my claims are true, that Project Pegasus existed, and that the U.S. Defense Department was not only sending individuals to distant locations in time-space by 1970, but was sending children, and one of them that was photographed in the very photograph to capture President Lincoln at Gettysburg on the day that he gave his famous address there.
I see. Excellent. Yes, and we're going to do just that. We are going to pause to take some calls from our switchboard. Let's see here. We have a caller on the line. Caller, are you there? Caller, are you there? I guess they're just listening. All right, we'll just move forward. All right. Yes. We have a caller from, let's see here, the, what is this, the 216 area code. Caller, are you there? Caller from the 216 area code, are you there? I guess they're just listening as well. I don't blame them. Like I always say, when I hear powerful information, I sit back and listen as well. All right. We also have a caller from the 718 area code. Caller, are you there? Caller, are you there? Oh, they're just listening too. Oh, well, I guess what we'll do then, Andy, is that we'll continue on. Yes, I would like to take the rest of our time talking about the Mars information. You know, we've covered a lot on teleportation, you know, fascinating information. But as you said earlier in the broadcast, you know, much of this information has been hidden in non-fiction books, if you will, movies, you know, television. We've been programmed to believe that, you know, this stuff is, oh, you know, this only happens in the movies. And, you know, as we've all, our first exposure to Mars was Martians and, you know, television. So when we hear about things like this in real life, we automatically dismiss it because we've been programmed by television. But please, you know, give us the information that you have on Mars. You know, you were here the last time and you gave some very, you know, eye-opening information on that. But please share your information concerning Mars.
Yeah, actually, let me just follow up on your thought about fictional programs being used to conceal the facts regarding these secret defense projects that the United States government has spent trillions of dollars on during and since World War II. Just yesterday on my Facebook site, somebody stated how fascinating my information is, and then said it's just like Star Trek and Stargate Atlantis on television. You know, it implicates some of the same ideas and technology. And I was very flattered, you know, that this particular person was responding to my information the way that she was, because I've spent now more than 10 years going back and retrieving the information, making trips to New Mexico, you know, making calls around the country to get a handle on the best possible, you know, information that I can. In other words, to be able to know with as much precision as possible about what happened and to share it with others. And the funny thing is that, you know, the two TV programs that she mentioned were probably the TV shows that with the most effectiveness have been used for disinformational purposes around the issue of teleporters and Stargate. Star Trek premiered on American television in 1966.
Oh, yeah.
And the form of teleportation that was depicted was quantum teleportation. In quantum teleportation, the teleportee is disintegrated, you know, theoretically or fictionally in this instance, as we saw on the teleport units on board the Enterprise. The individual is disintegrated and then reassembled elsewhere. This is the opposite of what Project Pegasus was doing, and in fact, the form of teleportation that was depicted on Star Trek was addressed by Jack Pruitt during our training, and he said, does anybody here know why we can't use that to get people from one place to the other in the time-space continuum? And I said, because it would kill them. And Jack said, right, Andy, why would it kill them? And I said, well, you take all their cells and disintegrate them. So even if you could reintegrate their cells, you would still causing a cessation of their biological functions. And he says, right, so the form of teleportation, at least for human beings, that is depicted on Star Trek, we cannot use because it would kill living organisms. He said maybe we can use it to ship inanimate objects, but we certainly can't use it to move human beings through the quantum hologram. So Star Trek was such a great show. I'm a huge fan of it myself, that in the public's imagination, teleportation is what was done on Star Trek. But I'm distinguishing the fact that I'm distinguishing the fact that the teleportation that was actually achieved in America's secret defense labs around that same period was the opposite. Basically, it was creating a tunnel in the time-space continuum through which the individual passed uninjured. The cells of the teleportee were never altered, at least not directly. There may have been quantum field effects. I know that we were becoming very dehydrated. The child teleportees have been developing a disease that mimics diabetes in adulthood. Courtney Hunt, my CIA liaison, had stated to me that the adult teleportees were developing heart valve defects. So the radiation effects inside the Vortal tunnel may have been injuring people, but we were passing through the tunnel relatively uninjured. But if they had tried to do what they were doing on Star Trek, we would have been killed. Then you have the example of Stargate Atlantis. Stargate Atlantis is a phenomenal show, just like Star Trek, maybe even a greater show. It's an incredible work of human imagination and creativity. Again, I'm a huge fan of it. I haven't watched a lot of the episodes, but the episodes I've seen have clearly been superb works of fiction. The problem is that they use in the title of their show one of the devices from Project Pegasus. I just described how the sixth form of quantum access, the Stargate, which was at the Surreal's cultural compound, was this huge device that we jumped through to reach the distant future, 2045. And also, in the first episode of Stargate Atlantis, they dropped the name of the actual DARPA project in which time travel was achieved, Project Pegasus. So as long as the general public continues to be fed these fictional accounts, and so long as these fictional, science fictional shows use terms and pseudo-technologies drawn from actual experience, when somebody like me steps forward, the public says, oh, well, this is the disinformational purpose of such shows. The general public says, this individual is just being inspired by this TV show. We've all seen Star Trek. We've seen Teleportations. We know the word Stargate. It's in Stargate Atlantis. Heck, the first episode of Stargate Atlantis was Project Pegasus. This person's a delusional type or a person with an overactive imagination who has just been inspired by, in the most pedestrian way, by some of our greatest works of TV science fiction. No. I'm an actual experiencer, and those shows were scripted to include facts and technologies, terms and technologies from the actual program. And I think that, in a sense, that's a violation of our human rights. That means, in other words, the mass public has been subjected to disinformation that causes the general public to be confused about our true claims. And I think, in a sense, that's a form of false light publicity, or it's an abuse of power, because it takes real experiencers of people who have contributed and risked their lives in the America's defense effort, and it subjects them to public disbelief, if not public fear, ridicule, hostility, and contempt. I mean, I've received my share of hate mail merely for embracing the highest interests of the American people by telling them the truth about Project Pegasus. So I just want to clarify that these shows are brilliant works of fiction, but they're not just that. They're brilliant works of disinformation, and they've been used to conceal the terminology and the technologies that have been part of these real secret projects. Now, I've just described the time travel we were doing via the 7 forms of quantum access from the time I first jumped to Santa Fe with my dad during the 1967-68 time frame through the late summer of 1972. They ended up using teleportation to New Mexico with quantum displacement, having us teleport not just back to New Jersey, but back to New Jersey on the day we left, to sandwich 4 phantom summers into those 5 years. The summers of 1970, 71, 73 pre-experienced jumping there from fall of 71, and then the fall of 72. So there was kind of a quantum entanglement that, or twist that they worked by having us pre-experience 1973, and then we experienced the summer of 1972 in quantum displacement in New Mexico. And what I mean by quantum displacement is then when those summers ended, we would jump through the teleport at Sandia, not just back to Curtis Wright, but Curtis Wright on the day that we had left. So those experiences in New Mexico collapsed as the time loop produced by quantum displacement was closed. So I'm not 48 and a half right now. I'm more like 49 and a half biologically. Likewise, because my father spent, he told me late in his life, 8 extra years in New Mexico in quantum displacement. When he died in 1990 at age 66, he was actually biologically around age 74. And I can show photographs of my parents who were only 2 years apart. My mother was born in 1925. My father was born 2 years previously in 1923. They're photographs from around 1970, when my mother was 47 and my father biologically was supposed to be 49. He looks like he's in his late 50s because biologically he was. He had aged those additional 8 years, while in quantum displacement in New Mexico. Wow. So this also is a question that comes up frequently because of the H.G. Wells aspect of time travel being about the acceleration of time. It's not. Time travel involves moving from point to point in a quantum hologram. So when you get there virtually instantaneously, you have the same aging of the human organism that you have in normal diurnal experience when you're not time traveling. You just pick up more time if you then jump back to your original point on your alpha timeline. So I'm about a year older than my birth certificate. The difference between my birth certificate and today's date indicates when my dad died, he had picked up about an extra 8 biological years. And that explains the difference in their appearance around 1970, 71, 72. He'd already done much of that quantum displacement in New Mexico. So I was out of the project. I had a fairly normal and non-involved adolescence in junior high, high school, and early college in Los Angeles. We moved to Chatsworth, California in November of 72. I had tried to write up my project experiences as we were leaving the house in New Jersey in November of 72, and my father found my notes and admonished me that I was never supposed to write down what happened, and ripped up those notes and actually flushed them down the toilet of our house as we were packing. And in a sense, that was the first draft of my book, because I was trying to piece together my memories ever since. And I finally started to focus on them when I was in my mid to late 30s. And that's what's resulted in my telling of the story. I now have the whole story of what happened to me in childhood reduced to practice. But in the formulation of those time travel experiences in childhood, I kind of ignored the data points involving Mars that occurred when I was a child attached to Project Pegasus. And then the ultimate trip to Mars that I took two trips, one in July and then in August of 1981. I was approached in 1981 by Courtney M. Hunt, who was a CIA agent that was placed in my life as a kind of an advisor. And throughout June of 1981, he kept on asking me a question I really did not want to be asked, which was, so do you want to go to Mars? And when he initially brought it up early in the summer there, I said, Courtney, how am I going to go there? Rocket? And he laughed ruefully and said, you know how we can get somebody from point A to point B? No, you're going to teleport there. And I said, well, will I be able to get back? And he said, sure. And he laughed, you know. And I really did not want to go, not so much because I didn't want to go on the great adventure of going to another planet, but on one level I was worried about not getting back. I clearly was feeling the spiritual yearning of wanting to complete my destiny here on Mother Earth. I'm a very home and earth-centered kind of person. All my planets are earth signs. I'm a Virgo. You know, I'm interested in architecture and city planning and the environment, and my whole soul calling, so to speak, my spiritual yearning was to focus on Earth and the cultivation of it, and not just be on some, you know, distant planet.
Oh, yeah.
And I also didn't want to be in the military again because I had had such negative experiences on Project Pegasus. They were doing things, for example, virtually torturing us to try to brainwash us to forget what we were experiencing. So I did not want to put myself back in that sadomasochistic environment that the U.S. military often is. I mean, I'm proud to have served my country, and I think that those who serve in our military are great Americans, and I'm proud that I served our defense effort in the way that I did as a participant in a classified defense project. But I really just didn't want to be in that social environment of bullying and of top-down leadership where you're simply told what's going to happen. It's just not where I was at by my third year of college, or the summer before my third year in college. And I said, Courtney, why do I have to go to Mars? And he said, the survival of the human race depends on it. Now note, he did not say the survival of the human race on Earth. He said the survival of the human race depends on it. I said, okay, if that's the case, that's more important than my life or my experience. I'll go. Now, what did the CIA know about me, and how did it relate to my project experiences in Pegasus, and why would they have asked me to go? We don't really know the answer to those questions in terms of why the specific motive of why they sent me to Mars. But here's what we know. We know that they knew I was in Pegasus because Hunt had been asking me questions about Santa Fe and all the other project facts, you know, from the time he first met me in late spring or early summer of 81. We know that when I was a child, the CIA knew about my later Mars findings because my father came back to the house around the time that we first teleported to Santa Fe and had a copy of an intelligence report where there were summarized excerpts, apparently by an intelligence analyst, of passages from my 2008 paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. And I snatched that file out of his hands, something unlike anything I'd ever done elsewhere in childhood. And I saw it was a CIA memorandum that said, Andrew Basiago, The Discovery of Life on Mars, 2008. And then it was summarized content. It was like 3 or 4 pages of passages from my paper, articulated in the life forms that I would find on Mars in 2008 in NASA photograph PIA 10214. We know that when my father was giving me a haircut, he took out of an envelope a picture of the humanoid being that I found in that NASA photograph 10214 on inside a rock enclosure on Tsiolkovsky Ridge, which is west of the Home Plate Plateau in the Columbia Basin of the Goosette Crater of Mars. which is essentially the iconic image for life on Mars. It's as significant as, let's say, the face on Mars at Cydonia as the iconic image for ancient life on Mars, that great researchers like Richard Hoagland and Mike Barra and Carl Munk and George Haas and Richard Saunders and others have shown us for the last 30 years, all this evidence of ancient life on Mars. What I contributed in my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, is that Mars is not only a planet literally with hundreds of fascinating ancient artifacts that we'll be exploring during the 21st century, but has an indigenous ecology as well that has humanoid and animal life forms. Mars is an inhabited planet. And the CIA knew that I would be associated with the discovery of this information as a child because here's another example of an overlap between Pegasus and Mars. In fall of 1971, shortly after I had turned age 10, this is shortly after Halloween on 1971, I had a very bad case of bronchitis as a result of going out trick-or-treating on Halloween of 1971 when I was sick. But I inveigled and cajoled my mom to let me go out even when I had a cough, and I got a very severe case of bronchitis. And when I was recuperating from that illness, my father came in the sick room there at our house in New Jersey and said, "Son, I have something to show you." And he said, "What is it?" "It's something you're going to write in the future." And he opened up one of these envelopes with the red wax security seal on it, and he handed me a reproduction of an academic paper. And he said, "Look at the title." And I read, "The Discovery of Life on Mars." And he goes, "Now look it down at the bottom of the first page there, who writes it?" And it said Andrew D. Basiago, even though at that age I hadn't been confirmed as a Roman Catholic, so I hadn't taken the middle name Daniel yet. And he said, "Now look what date you write it." And it said 2008, copyright 2008. And he said, how old are you going to be when you write this paper?" And I said, 47. And he goes, "Right." And he goes, "Well, son, the purpose of this exercise is for you to read this paper, read all of the text, all of the captions, study the photographs, try to relate the captions to the photographs and the photographs to the text and the text to the photographs. And I'm going to leave, and I'm going to come back in several hours, and I want you to just totally immerse yourself in this paper." And I said, "Why, Dad?" And he said, "Because when you write this paper in the future, we want it to contain as much data about Mars as possible."
Wow.
So here's an example of one of the things that they decided to do on the threshold of quantum access. In the same way they wanted to optimize the performance of the U.S. presidents by psychologically preparing them for their destinies years in advance by taking a young Columbia University's undergraduate named Barack Obama into a meeting and saying, "Listen, we've got some disturbing news for you. What is it? You're going to be president, 30 years from now." In a similar way, they were letting me read a paper I would write in the future. They were engaged in quantum entanglement. In other words, they were sharing data with me that wouldn't be produced until the future, but that in the same way that a set of mirrors will reflect each other, like in a barber shop, the future content was being brought back in time, and I was being influenced by it, and in turn, that influence would be taken forward in time and inform the later writing of my paper. There was also a meeting that my father and I had with 3 Martian humanoids who looked very much like us as they were leaving a technical liaison meeting at Curtiss-Wright. And these individuals were wearing flight suits, sort of silver flight suits, and one of them turned to my father and said in perfectly unaccented standard American English, but with a very high voice, "It was a pleasure visiting your beautiful planet again, Ray, and a pleasure to meet you again. Thank you for introducing us to your young son, Andrew. I hope we can meet again." And then they got in their little silver ship and went out on the tarmac and took off at about 12,000 miles per hour. I was taken to that meeting by my dad because he said, "The Martians heard about you from us and they want to meet you." So apparently what had happened in this aerospace technical liaison meeting between engineers like my dad who were working on things like the ramjet, like the B-70 atomic-equipped strategic bomber, and these early high-performance jet aircraft of the United States, long before the Aurora would achieve similar speed as the Martian, conventional ships. The Martians were there sharing information with our government. And so I think this is important to to break through what I call, well, I haven't given a name yet, but if you look at the UFO literature and the whole discussion in exopolitics, it's always focusing on the Greys and other species who are essentially time travelers from distant star systems. What ends up getting diluted and sort of pushed out of the discussion is the fact that at least Mars, the planet that every 2 years comes closest to Earth, is an inhabited planet. And its humanoids have not only visited Earth, but been in technical liaison with the United States government. That's I think should be one of the principal issues in exopolitics. I'm not urging us to ignore alien contact, alien abduction, any potential or threat posed by voyagers here from distant star systems, literally time travelers in time ships, not just extraterrestrials in spaceships. But yet we can't ignore the fact that Mars is inhabited and this kind of contact has occurred. In fact, Curtis, let me just share with you, I don't know if I've ever discussed it on radio before, but after I discussed this 1970 meeting with my dad and these Martians at Curtis Wright, one of my law clients, who was a secretary for Howard Hughes at Hughes Aircraft, who was so close to Howard Hughes that he used to eat her lunch off of her plate. Okay, like if she was eating a ham sandwich with some grapes on the plate, he would reach over and steal her grapes. Okay, that's what she said. But this elderly law client of mine is just a very dear and sweet woman. We're going to be writing up this story for the Examiner. I think I'll introduce it if I have the good fortune to be a correspondent for the Examiner. I'm going to be giving her identity, her name, what background she had with Hughes. Hughes came to her and said, Rose, some Martians are going to be coming to your desk today, so give them this. And he put some technical devices in like a jiffy pack on her desk or in her hand and said, so when they show up and they tell you they're from Mars, give them this. In other words, one of my law clients also had an interaction with Martians who were in technical liaison with Howard Hughes at Hughes Aircraft during the same time period, which is just extraordinary good luck on my part. This is the kind of good luck that has obtained during my investigation. I mean, here I'm claiming publicly that my father and I, whose aerospace career can be proved by the documents that I can show, and maybe putting on my website, that we met Martians at Curtis Wright, and here's this dear, sweet woman whose career at Hughes Aircraft can be proved through her tax forms.
Yeah. Oh, Andy, I'm sorry, buddy, but I have to jump in here. We're getting ready to really wind down. We have about 3 minutes left. But, oh yeah, I'm going to be in your ear within 24 to 48 hours to arrange your next visit because there's so much more to share. So, briefly, my friend, just give everybody your website and let them know what you got coming up and how you can be reached.
Well, yeah, right now we're focusing on the Mars connection. I just did an interview with the great-granddaughter of President Eisenhower, Laura Magdalene Eisenhower, who was approached to join the secret Mars colony in 2006. So that's sort of where where we are in the investigation. We're finding that major aspects of the Mars experiences of Michael Relf, myself, Laura Eisenhower, and Arthur Newman, the so-called Henry Deacon informant of Project Camelot, indirectly corroborate each other in very specific ways. So that part of the disclosure effort is being undertaken by Alfred Lambermont Weber in his writings for the Examiner. So we're going to be providing more information about Mars. I'm going to try to finish my book about Project Pegasus this year. And in the next month or so, I'm going to be presenting about 50 more major findings by myself and my colleagues Ross Curley and Louis Michael Reinhardt for our organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society. We have new data regarding humanoid and animal life on Mars. We've even captured images of statues or humanoids in some of the glass tubes on Mars. And we also have a life form that we've identified in a photograph that NASA has recently released. So that's going to be occurring hopefully for Earth Day. We were trying to release those on March 22nd, the day that the Zodiac goes into Aries, which is Mars. But I got behind on my work because of the responsibilities of my law practice. So we've got more information to share about Project Pegasus. I'm going to be putting the people, places, technologies, and experiences in a kind of a summary format up at projectpegasus.net, which is my Project Pegasus website. We're going to be releasing abundant data of life on Mars in the Annals of Mars at www.projectmars.net. And then I would urge any of your listeners to join my Facebook community. You can find me under Andrew D. Basiago, my last name being spelled B-A-S-I-A-G-O. And we've got 2 Facebook groups where we're tracking my truth campaign regarding U.S. achievements in time travel and also the U.S. presence on Mars. The first Facebook group is called Project Pegasus, and I would invite members of the Facebook community at large to join that group site. And then we have another group site called The Discovery of Life on Mars, where you can follow my work and that of Alfred Lambermont Weber, and hopefully a growing cadre of contributors, because a lot of data is coming forward now. And what we're trying to sponsor is a sense of collegiality in exopolitics and ufology, so that we don't view ourselves as individuals at war with each other, trying to provide discrepant data, but we really start to maintain a great debate, a great democratic discourse about these esoteric subjects, so that the people of this planet can know the truth, and so the truth can set them free. And so I would invite all of your listeners to visit my websites, projectpegasus.net and projectmars.net, follow my releases of information there as a figure in the disclosure movement, and then join our ongoing discussions at Facebook.
Thank you so much, Mike.